Hi everyone, I'm Mims and welcome back to the channel. Thanks for being here. So today's video is all about the swords in the Drop 'em 78. Just in case you're new or are curious about what Drop 'em 78 is, Drop 'em 78 was started by Esther from Mindful Tarot a few years ago, and it encompasses the last 78 days of the year, and it's a way through a tarot deck from starting on October the 15th going through December 31st. And it's a challenge, and there's several ways you can participate. You can do it in social media and so forth, but it's a card a day. And so the acronym stands for drop anchor with the sword, or no, drop anchor with the pentacles, respond with the wands, open up with the cups, and then pierce through with the swords, and then manifest with the majors. So you're doing each of the, you're going through each of the suits ace through king. So today is Tuesday, December the 9th. I'll post this video tomorrow, Wednesday the 10th. But today is the day wrapping up. Today would be the King of Swords day. And then tomorrow will be the majors, beginning manifesting with the majors, starting with the Fool. So the idea is that you're, as you're winding your way through a tarot deck, you might pick a second deck or another divination tool as a point of reflection, as a point of calibration, as Esther puts it. And so what I've been doing is I've been making these videos so far it's been every couple of weeks, talking a little bit about my journey through it. At the beginning, I had hoped to really work with a tarot friend, and we kind of both have, or at least, it very much could have been because I wasn't a great partner, but that we didn't really keep up with that. But surprisingly, I kind of have been on track for this suit. Yeah, compared to last year felt pretty easy. It was the first year I ever did it, and I think there was only one day where I had to sort of catch up, if that was, if that's even a thing. Anyway, here we are. So let's talk a little bit about the swords. And I have been using two decks. I have been using, because there's several different ways that you could use your second deck or your second divination tool. You can use a tarot deck and use the same cards so that you're really comparing sort of apples to apples. Or you might pull as another card more as like an apples to oranges, so you're kind of comparing and contrasting. Oh, by the way, it's really cold today, so the heat just kicked in. Anyway, I'm using the American Renaissance Tarot, or working with, I guess, the American Renaissance Tarot by Thea Wirsching and illustrated by Celeste Pille. And then I'm working with, as a second deck, my calibration deck, I'm using the Pixie's Line Art Tarot, which is published by Monde Press, and it's just the line work as implied of the Waite-Smith deck. No color and so forth. So, and what I've been doing is using the same cards, kind of as comparison. So I'll just show you them. And I'm just doing them kind of as we go through. So for anyone not familiar, the American Renaissance Tarot came out in 2021, and it is based on both literary and history, kind of literary history and literature of the American Renaissance. And, depending on what source you look at, the American Renaissance sometimes is only like 4 or 5 years, sometimes it's a little bit longer, but it goes, in this book, I think the deck, it goes from 1820-ish until around 1825. So the years prior to the lead up to the Civil War, and then a few years after. And that period of history has always been fascinating to me because so much happened in that particular time frame. And of course, when you're looking at history, you're looking at a lot of different things, right? You're looking at a lens. So one of the things that I love about this particular deck is that bringing in that history and that perspective, and looking at the literature. So a good chunk of the swords is actually some of Edgar Allan Poe's work. And one of the things that's fun about this deck, but also can be a little tricky, is, and I got it not too long before I started the challenge, is that while this, I would say the scenes are definitely sort of set up to be similar, so that if you're just reading it like on the surface, like what's in the picture, if you're familiar with Rider-Waite-Smith, I think you can go just fine. But there's also a lot going in the cards, and you might, you know, want to know like, okay, who is that in them? Who is that? And, you know, why are they so distraught, for instance? Here we've got Poe. And then the court cards have been renamed. So you have the Pioneer as the page, and then you have the Missionary as the knight, and then the Queen and the King are the same. See, so there's Poe here. And generally each of the suits have been mostly focused on one particular author, although there's often more than one. So I just wanted to read a couple of quick things that I thought were interesting from this guidebook. By the way, this guidebook is lovely, and I really have been enjoying getting to know this deck through reading the guidebook. Because it does get into like, okay, who's portrayed in that particular card and why and so forth. So I like saying this. In most tarot traditions, or so I'm just going to read this little bit. In most tarot traditions, swords represent the element air in the ancient metaphysical quadrinity of air, water, fire, and earth. Swords do violence. They cut, and for this reason they are associated with the realm of the intellect and its related spheres, writing and speaking. And then here's another quote that I quite enjoyed. The sword suit is the most violent suit in the tarot because our thoughts and internal chatter create most of the pain that we suffer in life. All of your experiences are filtered through your mind. And if your thoughts have a perpetual negative cast, like a raven, relentlessly repeating nevermore, then you're likely to see yourself as the victim of elaborate plots perpetrated by others. If swords at their worst generate thorny plots and problems, swords at their best orchestrate beauty. Swords are sometimes depicted as the writing pens, and they are in that deck, as you saw. What else? And they create otherworldly adventures, fantasies, engrossing adventures, and exquisitely wrought poetry. The sword's ability to cut represents the power of decision making, and everyone knows that good writing is the result of good choices. So, and I love that she says the Ace of Swords is the seed of genius. So, what have I been thinking about? I've been thinking a lot about the swords, and what kind of has struck me today was earlier in the Drop 'em 78, I have felt kind of up and down. And I had a friend last year who talked about that the time of Drop 'em 78, they had done Drop 'em 78, I think, several years, and they talked about how that often it felt like there was a major shakeup in this time of year. And obviously it wasn't brought on by the Drop 'em 78, but there was something about the time of year and going through that whole deck and having that time for personal reflection and that intention. Anyway, this person was saying that it really, you know, in years past had brought up a lot. And weirdly, I have not felt that with the swords. I definitely was feeling it earlier, but right now, and you know how that goes, a little bit of peace and then something happens. But I've really been thinking a lot about the swords, and we think about the duality of swords, right? We think about a decision. We must choose A or B if we're going to be, really kind of cut and dry. But I also think a lot about, we think about swords and we think about decisions. I think we also replay our words, and not, sometimes it can be as simple as like, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. That's embarrassing. Or, you can't take the words back. Sometimes they've already caused too much damage. And then the swords also can be regret. I sometimes think about like the blade of the sword, that kind of two-sided nature. We think about like hindsight and foresight. And, what's the joke or the saying that hindsight is always 20/20. It's easy to go back and look and think, well, I wish I'd done that differently, or I wish I had made that decision differently. And I had a fairly monumental birthday a few months ago, and I was thinking a lot about like what is middle age like, or what's considered middle age and what's considered older or whatever. And I think sometimes about some of the regrets that I had younger, and I look at them now because I have been doing a little bit of a taking stock, thinking about some of those past decisions, but also kind of thinking about like, okay, how do I want to move forward in certain ways, and what can I take with me, and so forth. And I think that for most of us, it's kind of cheesy to say it, but I think it's true for the most part. For the most part, I think most of us make decisions the best we can in the moments with the information that we have, right? And of course, it's not just, we're not computers just spitting out, it's not just a geometry proof, where, okay, well, we start with this and then we get to the final decision. It's not just an input of information and then spitting out the data, okay, well, we must do this. But you might know people that way, that are very linear, and then you might know others, and I can be a little bit of both. I can be linear, and then I can be very much a little bit of this gathering up lots and lots of ideas and things. And there's even a decision paralysis. I was just pulling the cards so that I could make this video, and I was thinking about when we get, particularly in Pixie's drawing, Pamela Colman-Smith. So we have the Two of Swords here, and then when we get to the Nine of Swords, this very much looks like, here it seems that it was fairly clear. There's one decision to make, and there's two choices. And then we get to 9, and we've basically perhaps continued to either not make a decision or regretting that decision, and now we've wound ourselves up so much that it seems hard or impossible to get out of that situation. But as you can see here, or as it's often talked about in tarot, maybe not often, but sometimes it's talked about in tarot, that this person can very easily escape this self-imposed dilemma. And whether you're looking back, if you think of the Two Swords that way, or thinking about the swords in terms of like, the analogy of a tongue, right? Being sharp. And that you can't always you might be able to look back at decisions, but you can't always take back your words. And I think a lot about, when I think of swords and decisions and so forth, and ideas, there's also the action that comes as a result of those, right? We're not just thinking people, we also do things. And whether we're intentionally making decisions or sort of living in a day-to-day without intention. You know, you might have made a decision 5 years ago to do a certain thing, and you're still living that out. What does that look like? Or kind of coasting along, perhaps. Not you, I'm just thinking, whether it's myself or you know, even just thinking about possibilities. I even think about times of my life where I wasn't making decisions. I was sort of just going and not really making a decision. And sometimes not making a decision is making a decision, right? And I'm not saying that everything has to be about progress. I'm not saying that everything is about like, ooh, it must be better, we must do this, this, and this. But more about that intention. And, you know, how do we show up for others? How do we show up for ourselves? How can we show, you know, this tree behind me, you know, what are our gifts in terms of what our patience, our time, our listening ear, maybe the person who doesn't judge someone for what they're in the midst of. I remember years ago talking to my sister on the phone, and she said, you know, I just need you to listen. I don't need the advice right now. I just need you to listen. And that was such a good reminder. I think so much of the, well, I don't know about so much of the time, but I know that sometimes we're so eager to give advice. And I think that that's why, because sometimes it's easy to have perspective on somebody else's problems or on their decisions that they need to make. And you think, oh, I wish I could have that dilemma rather than my own burdens. Or it seems really clear what should be done, but maybe it's not clear for the other person, you know, and that's why sometimes we go to certain friends or for that perspective. And I've talked about this before, and I know others have as well. I think that that's why a lot of us go to tarot, because tarot can help. It's still our interpretation of the cards, but if you're reading for yourself or you're reading for others, you are looking at a set of cards as a way of, in some cases, kind of projecting those things that feel muddied up inside. And sometimes a reading will seem very clear. You know, like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And of course, if you're doing a reading for yourself, then these cards become the lens, but it's what you're dealing with and thinking about and questioning that comes through in the cards. So these cards mean something different today than they will in a year from now, right? And of course, in Drop 'em 78, you're not just picking one card, right? We're working our way through the deck. And in my case, I'm using, you know, the same card as that perspective, just for comparison. But the cards can help us with that perspective. The cards often help us in those swords moments. You know, when we see where is it? You know, when we see the 10 of Swords, you know, that's a pretty grim picture. But often the interpretation is, well, at least the worst is over. You know, and there's nowhere but up, right? Is one way of interpreting that card. And so you know, sometimes, whether it's the perspective of another person or just a walk, and then you come back and things feel easier, or things don't feel easier because you can't see, you know, for lack of sleep, or you can't see your way out of, you can't see your way out, whereas to somebody else it seems very obvious the way through. Anyway, I just realized that at least over the last couple of weeks, I've kind of had some peace thinking about old things. I think I brought it up because I was curious, how do I feel now, you know, with the perspective of a certain age, and with the perspective of, you know, things that I used to think were regrets. Like, I maybe still feel the same way about it, but I've just decided that it's not a regret. Like, those have shaped who I am. They have helped me to be empathetic to others in certain situations. That those struggles, you know, I did the best that I think for the most part, I've done the best that I could with what I had at the time, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about this, especially in those last couple of weeks, but I really am sort of proud of myself, if I can say that. No, I can say that. I am sort of proud of some of the struggles that I've been through, self-imposed and otherwise, economic or emotional, or, you know, there've been a lot of things. But if I hadn't had that, I wouldn't have the perspective that I have now. And obviously, it would be, if I were another person, I would have a different set of situations and scenarios that I would be reflecting upon. But I think what I appreciate about the swords is that they do give us perspective. And we think often about whether or not something is bad or good, but maybe it's not. And I saw this recently, and I kind of liked it. It was actually decor in an Etsy shop online, and I thought it was kind of cute. But one of the things was, what if it all works out? You know, often, not always, but often, the worst thing we come up with is way worse than what actually happens. Whether it's a decision or something brewing that feels really hard to deal with. Anyway, all I can say is I have appreciated the last couple of weeks to maybe make some peace with some past decisions, you know, and I'm sure that some of those will, you know, I don't think that there's like a complete finish line. You know, a year from now, I might have some angst about one of those past decisions that I'm feeling peaceful about right now, but also just that there is that perspective of age, and that, like, you know, put down your burdens and take a breath. Put down your burdens and take a breath. You know, sometimes that's all we can do in the moment of angst, of whatever is going on. But put down your burdens and take a breath, and maybe pat yourself on the back. You're doing the best you can. Anyway, I hope you're well. I hope you're taking care of yourself. I hope you're finding joy. I hope you're finding ways to connect to others and take care of others in the earth in a mutual aid sense. And I hope to see you in another video. So I will be I'll post this tomorrow on Wednesday the 10th, and then my last Drop 'em 78 video I will record and post on New Year's Eve, I guess, which is the 31st. And then I have several other videos planned for the next few weeks, so stay tuned if you would like. Anyway, thanks for being here and take care of yourself. Thank you.